Hello everybody, my name is Asemota, and I'm a pencil partner working on their virtual series learning through Hands-On Nashville. Last video we learned about solving equations that have variables with exponents. This time, we'll be looking more into the applications of variables in the form of functions. Before we begin, however, allow me to remind you to stay quarantined, keep yourself hydrated, and get tested if you show symptoms. Now, let's talk math. What is a function? A function is a system of variables that takes an input and gives an output. Now, functions are different from the variables we've talked about, as in that we aren't solving for them in the same way. In the variables we've looked at, we solve for them by we were trying to solve to get a specific value for the variables or the variable or variables. But with functions, we're gonna give the function a value and get a value as an input. So the the values of the function will be determined by the input that we give it and the function itself. Functions always have two or more variables in them. In our case, we're only dealing with two variable functions, which is one input and one output, as more than one would be very complex, and this is just the basic introduction to functions. And these variables, one variable is going to be the dependent variable, and all the other variables are going to be independent variables. And in this case, again, there's only going to be one independent and one dependent because there are only two variables. We're only working with two variable functions. But in a function, there can only be one independent, sorry, there can only be one dependent variable and multiple independent variables. It could be multiple inputs, but only one output. Let's look more at what the independent and dependent variables are. Independent variables represent the input of the function. And these inputs are going to be on one side of the equation, and it's going to be an equation that can be reduced to a single value. And the independent variable in functions is going to be mostly denoted by x, as you can see here. X in this case is the independent variable. And the independent variable can be paired with any numbers or coefficients. It can have any coefficients or exponent, etc. applied to it. And that's important because the rules for the dependent variables are different. And the values of the independent variable are decided by the user. It's an input that the user gives the variable, and that will determine the output. So, important note, independent variable is usually the x, and there's an important reason why that is. We'll go over that in a later video, but know that in a function, x is usually the independent variable. It's not always the case. Sometimes y can be it and the x is the dependent variable, but it's a case-by-case thing, and the problem you're working with will tell you the independent and dependent, but know that x is usually the independent variable. And the dependent variable. The dependent variable is the output of the function. Its value isn't determined by the user, but determined by the equation that has the independent variable. And the independent variable in most functions is going to be y. Again, there's an important reason that we'll get into next video. So if you see y, you can assume that it's the dependent variable unless they tell you otherwise. But the dependent variable must be completely isolated, and it can't have any coefficients or numbers on its side of the equation. As you can see, this y is just by itself. It's just y because it's a dependent variable. It can only be y. And if it does have other things, other elements and numbers in the equation, it has to be changed so where it's just y, or else calculations will not be correct. It will not be able to be done. And each different value of the independent variable gives a different value for the dependent variable. Each input gives a different output. Now going back to formatting the dependent variable, we see we have the equation 6y minus 6 equals 12x. Well, we want to get this y by itself and with no coefficient. We'll have a coefficient of 1. That's where there's nothing in front of the y. If there's nothing in front of a variable, the coefficient is 1. Remember that. So to get this by itself, we use all rules that we've covered already when with solving for variables. Add 6 on both sides so that I can get rid of this -6, and that will give us 6y equals 12x plus 6. And then we have a 6 being multiplied by the y, so we want to divide all of the variables and numbers by 6, and that will give us y is equal to 2x plus 1, the previous equation we had. And now let's look at what we get when we input these values for the independent variable x. So when depending on what value we put for x, we get a different output. Because x is the input, we get to choose what it is, and y is determined by the value of x. So this is a table that shows us all of the values. And these values are gotten by doing the calculations in the equation. After we substitute the value of x for our input, we can then substitute it. For example, if we choose the value 0 for x, then we get 2 times 0, which is 0, plus 1. So it'll be 0 plus 1 is equal to 1. So when x is 0, y is 1. When the input is 0, the output is 1. Similarly, if we have x is 1, that'll be 2 times 1 plus 1, which will be 3. And 2 times 2 plus 1 equals to 5, and so on and so on. Why are functions useful? It seems that all this math that we're talking about is so abstract. What's the point of it all? Well, functions allow us to express relationships between two things, or two or more things, two things in the case of having two variables, that allow us to express their relationship numerically. Let's get an example. Let's say a car's value needs to be determined. And let's say the car has an initial value of $10,000. Each year after the car is released, the car drops $300 in value. How do we find the car's value depending on how much time has passed in years, or maybe not even um, a whole year, maybe just half a year or a tenth of a year? Well, we'd want to make a function, but what would our values be? To determine that, we want to look at all the values that are given to us. We want to look at which values are changing and which values change the values that are changing, and what values are remaining the same. And we see that the car has an initial value of $10,000. That's the car's initial value. Its initial value does not change. At time 0, which is when the car has just been made, its value is $10,000. So we know that if the input is 0, then the output will be 10,000. And that gives us a constant number, 10,000. Because in order for the output to be 10,000 and the input be 0, that means that 10,000 has to be added to whatever the independent variable is. We also see that the car drops in value by $300 each year, and that is going to be what determines the car's cost, the amount of years it has been. And since that is what determines the cost, that is the input of the function. And so that would be our x. And it says it drops every year by $300. So that if x were to be the year, that each year that passes since the car's creation, then we could say that it is 10,000 minus 300x. And this works because if 0 years have passed, if it's just been made, then that'd be 10,000 minus 300 times 0, which would be 10,000. And if it's been 1 year, then it'd be 10,000 minus 300 times 1, which would be 9,700. And y, the dependent variable, would be the cost because it's dependent on the amount of time that has passed, aka x, the independent variable. And so that gives us the equation y equals 10,000 minus 300x. and that's the introduction to functions. Today we've learned the basics of functions. I'll continue to stress how important math is in our lives. Right now, dealing with numbers and solving for variables and functions may seem pointless, but one thing's for sure. Math is something that will always be needed. The greatest careers, doctors, chemists, astronauts, and even lawyers require a strong foundation in math because the world is built upon calculations and numbers. The math we're studying now is simple, but it will pave the way to a great future. That being said, remember to stay safe out there and always train your problem solving skills. Goodbye and have a nice day.